November 18, 1962. Danny Castellano had just finished his second set at the Sands when he found his wife Maria tied to their bedroom chair, blood on her lips, terror in her eyes. The man she described had mentioned Danny by name. 3 hours earlier, Castellano had walked out of a meeting with Angelo Torino, refused to launder money through his club, refused to become another puppet in the family's entertainment empire. What happened next sent shockwaves through every casino on the Strip. The 5 families called emergency meetings. Frank Sinatra himself made calls to New York, because what they did to Maria Castellano wasn't just about money or territory. It was about sending a message that would echo through every dressing room in Vegas, across the family, and they don't just come for you, they come for everything you love. The night Danny Castellano learned that some stages come with a price written in blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Danny Castellano's hands shook as he untied the ropes binding Maria to their antique chair, the one she'd bought at an estate sale in Beverly Hills, the one where she liked to read Photoplay magazine on Sunday mornings. Now the velvet upholstery was stained with her blood, and Danny knew they'd never sit in this room the same way again. "Did you see his face?" Danny's voice came out as a whisper. He was afraid that speaking too loud might shatter what was left of his wife. Maria shook her head, dark hair falling across the bruise blooming on her cheek. "Ski mask. But Danny." She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "He knew things. About the meeting tonight. About what you told Angelo." The words hit Danny like a punch to the solar plexus. Only 4 people had been in that back room at the Desert Inn: himself, Angelo Torino, and Angelo's 2 lieutenants. Which meant, "Mr. Castellano?" The voice belonged to Detective Vincent Torino, Angelo's nephew, who arrived 20 minutes after Danny's frantic call to the police. Vinny stood in the bedroom doorway, his rumpled suit and tired eyes making him look older than his 43 years. "Paramedics want to check Mrs. Castellano over." "I'm fine," Maria said quickly. "Just bruised." But Danny could see she wasn't fine. The Maria who'd married him 7 years ago, the girl who'd danced on the Copacabana stage and laughed like silver bells, had something broken inside her now, something that might never heal. "We need to talk," Vinny said to Danny. "Privately." They stepped into the hallway of the modest ranch house Danny had bought in the suburbs, away from the Strip's neon glow. Most entertainers lived in the spotlight 24 hours a day, but Danny had always craved normalcy. A home where he could be Daniel from the Bronx instead of Danny Castellano, Vegas crooner. "You know who did this," Vinny said. It wasn't a question. "Your uncle made me an offer tonight. I said no." Danny lit a cigarette with hands that had finally stopped trembling. 3 hours later, some bastard is in my bedroom telling my wife that Danny Castellano needs to learn respect. Vinny pulled out a notepad, but Danny noticed he wasn't writing anything down. "What kind of offer?" "Come on, Vinny. You know what kind." Danny took a long drag. "Angelo wants me to run dirty money through the club, make it look like legitimate, gate receipts, turn the Blue Moon into just another mob laundry." The Blue Moon was Danny's pride, an intimate nightclub off the main drag where real music happened. Not the manufactured glamour of the casino showrooms, but honest-to-God jazz and blues. Artists like Miles Davis and Billie Holiday played there when they wanted to stretch their artistic muscles. "So you refused," Vinny said. "Damn right I refused. I've worked 15 years to build something clean in this city." Danny's voice hardened. "I won't let them turn my club into another dirty operation." But even as he said it, Danny felt his resolve cracking. Because Maria was in the bedroom with paramedics, and there was blood on their favorite chair, and the man who'd done this knew things that only family insiders should know. "Danny." Vinny's voice dropped lower. "I want to help you, but you need to understand something about my uncle. He doesn't make offers twice, and he doesn't forget when someone embarrasses him." Through the bedroom doorway, Danny could see Maria sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at her hands. She hadn't looked at him directly since he'd found her. It was like she was already retreating into herself, building walls that Danny might never be able to climb. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've got 24 hours to figure out if your principles are worth your wife's life." Vinny closed his notepad. Because whoever did this tonight, that was just the opening act. After Vinny left, Danny sat in his living room and stared at the framed photographs on the mantel. Him and Maria on their wedding day, the two of them with Dean Martin at the Flamingo. Maria laughing at some joke he couldn't remember anymore. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. "You've had time to think." Angelo's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I trust you've reached the right conclusion." Danny looked toward the bedroom where Maria was finally sleeping with the help of pills the doctor had left. She'd insisted on keeping the lights on. "The Blue Moon opens tomorrow night," Danny said. "Good. My accountant will be in touch about the new arrangement." Angelo paused. "And Danny? Welcome to the family." 15 years later, Vincent Vinny Torino sat in his cramped office above a pawn shop on East Charleston, watching the desert sun paint Las Vegas in shades of amber and regret. The neon hadn't come alive yet. That wouldn't happen until the sun died completely, but he could already hear the city's heartbeat starting to quicken. Somewhere out there, dice were rolling, cards were falling, and fortunes were changing hands in the space between one breath and the next. The photograph on his desk had faded over the years, but he could still make out the faces clearly enough. There was Danny Castellano, arm around his wife Maria outside the Blue Moon on what should have been the happiest night of their lives, the club's grand reopening after renovations. Vinny remembered taking that picture himself, back when he still believed in happy endings and thought being a cop meant protecting people instead of just cleaning up after the damage was done. Maria was gone now, not dead. That might have been kinder. She'd simply disappeared one morning in 1954, leaving nothing but a note that said she couldn't pretend anymore. Danny had spent 2 years looking for her before giving up and drinking himself into an early grave at 41. The Blue Moon had closed 6 months after she left, another casualty of a war between conscience and survival that conscience never seemed to win. "Mr. Torino?" The voice belonged to Sophie Chen, the 23-year-old secretary he'd hired more for her fierce loyalty than her typing skills. She stood in his doorway holding a manila envelope, her dark eyes reflecting the same wariness that seemed to infect everyone who worked too long in this city. "This came for you. No return address." Vinny accepted the envelope with the careful attention he'd learned to pay to anything unexpected. 15 years as a private investigator in Las Vegas had taught him that surprises usually came with body counts attached. The envelope was thick, substantial, with his name written in block letters that suggested education mixed with deliberate anonymity. "Sophie," he said without looking up, "why don't you call it an early day? Take Mickey to that movie he's been wanting to see." Sophie's face softened at the mention of her 8-year-old brother. It was the same expression she got every time Vinny reminded her that some things were more important than work. She'd been raising Mickey alone since their parents died in a car accident 3 years ago, and Vinny had learned that the fastest way to earn her gratitude was to remember that her world revolved around a gap-toothed kid who collected baseball cards and believed his sister hung the moon. "You sure? I can stay if—" "Go," Vinny said, managing something that might have passed for a smile. "Enjoy being young while you still remember how." After she left, Vinny poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and opened the envelope. Inside were photographs. Crime scene shots he recognized immediately despite the years that had passed. Maria Castellano tied to that antique chair, her face a map of bruises and terror. Danny's living room with furniture overturned and family photographs scattered across the floor like broken dreams. But there were other photos too, ones he'd never seen before. Images that showed details the official investigation had somehow missed or chosen to ignore. A cigarette butt near the bedroom window that didn't match Danny's brand. Fresh mud on the kitchen floor that suggested the intruder had waited inside the house before Maria came home. And strangest of all, a close-up of Maria's wrists that clearly showed the rope burns were older than the official timeline suggested. At the bottom of the stack was a single sheet of paper with a phone number and 4 words, "You owe him truth." Vinny's hand moved instinctively to the scar on his left shoulder. A souvenir from the night his partner Joe Ricci had pulled him out of an alley behind the Sahara and saved his life. Joe was family now, the closest thing to a brother Vinny had ever had. Joe was also the only other person who'd known enough about the Castellano case to have these photographs. The phone rang, splitting the silence like a gunshot. Vinny stared at it for 3 rings before answering, already knowing what he'd hear. 15 years is a long time to carry guilt. Joe's voice was exactly the same, Brooklyn accented and rough as sandpaper. Maybe it's time we talked. Outside, the neon signs were beginning their nightly resurrection, bathing the city in artificial light that promised everything and delivered nothing. Vinny thought about Sophie and Mickey, about the quiet life he'd built for himself in the ruins of his police career, about all the reasons he should hang up the phone and pretend this moment had never happened. Instead, he said, "Where?" "Binion's Horseshoe," Joe said. "Top floor. 1 hour." The line went dead before Vinny could respond, leaving him staring at the receiver like it might explain how his carefully constructed world had just collapsed in the space of a phone call. He set it down with the deliberate care of a man handling explosives, then reached for the bourbon bottle again. His hand stopped halfway there. Whatever was coming next, he'd need his wits sharp as broken glass. The photographs lay scattered across his desk, like tarot cards predicting a future he didn't want to see. 15 years of sleepless nights, of waking up in cold sweats reliving that crime scene, of watching Danny Castellano drink himself to death 1 shot at a time, and Joe had known the truth all along. Vinny picked up the close-up of Maria's wrists, studying the rope burns that told a story completely different from the one in the official report. These weren't fresh wounds from a single night of terror. They were layered, healed, and reopened, the kind of marks that spoke to repeated trauma over weeks or months, which meant Maria Castellano hadn't been the victim of a random home invasion intended to send her husband a message. She'd been a prisoner long before that night. The revelation hit him like a Louisville slugger to the chest. All those interviews where Maria had seemed distant, disconnected, staring at her hands instead of meeting his eyes. He'd attributed it to shock, to the natural trauma of what she'd endured. But shock didn't explain the way she'd flinched when Danny tried to comfort her, or how she'd known details about the attack that she claimed she couldn't remember. Maria hadn't been rescued that night. She'd been discovered. Vinny stood and walked to his office window, looking down at the street where tourists stumbled between casinos with the glazed expressions of the financially doomed. 15 years ago, he'd been one of them in a way, gambling with his career, betting everything on the belief that being Angelo Torino's nephew would somehow protect him from the moral compromises that destroyed every other honest cop in this city. He'd been wrong about that, just like he'd been wrong about everything else. The drive to Binion's took him through the heart of downtown, past the neon cowboys and glittering facades that turned night into artificial day. The Horseshoe was old-school Vegas, a place where the serious gamblers came to play with house money and professional respect. Benny Binion ran it like a frontier saloon dropped into the atomic age, complete with the kind of hospitality that came with a .45 caliber smile. The top floor was reserved for high-stakes poker and private conversations that needed to stay private. Vinny rode the elevator up in silence, watching the floor numbers climb like a countdown to Judgment Day. When the doors opened, Joe Ricci was waiting for him. He looked older, they both did, but Joe still carried himself like the beat cop who'd walked the toughest neighborhoods in Brooklyn without ever backing down from a fight. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and there were new lines around his eyes, but his handshake was still firm enough to crack bones when he meant business. "You look good, Vinny. Clean living agrees with you." "Cut the shit, Joe." Vinny's voice was steady, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Those photographs didn't develop themselves. Joe nodded toward a corner table where 2 cups of coffee were already waiting. 15 years I've been carrying this around. You know what that does to a man? Watching his partner, his friend, tear himself apart over something he couldn't have prevented? They sat across from each other like poker players studying their hands. The casino sounds drifted up from below, chips clicking, slot machines singing their electronic lullabies, the occasional whoop of victory from someone who didn't know the house always won in the end. "You were there," Vinny said. It wasn't a question. "I was on Angelo's payroll for 8 years before that night. Started small, looking the other way when certain shipments came through the port, making sure patrol cars took extended coffee breaks in specific neighborhoods. You know how it works." Joe's voice carried the weight of confessions made too late. but Maria Castellano wasn't supposed to be part of any of it. Then why? Because she figured it out. Joe pulled out a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. Maria was smart, smarter than Danny ever gave her credit for. She started noticing things. Money in accounts that shouldn't exist. Phone calls at strange hours. The way certain people looked at her husband when they thought she wasn't watching. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that made Vinny's stomach clench with the certainty of betrayal. She was going to expose Angelo. Worse than that. She was going to expose all of us. Vinny felt the air leave his lungs like he'd been sucker punched. The coffee in front of him had gone cold, but he couldn't have swallowed it anyway. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. Around them, the soft murmur of high-stakes poker continued, chips clicking and cards whispering against felt. The soundtrack to a world where everyone had secrets and survival meant knowing which ones to keep buried. All of us, Vinny repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. How many? Joe's laugh was bitter as day-old coffee. You really want that list? Because once I start naming names, you can't unknow what you'll know. He took a long drag from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl between them like a confession made visible. Maria had been documenting everything for months. Bank records, meeting times, license plates. She even had photographs of money changing hands outside the precinct. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Vinny gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to bolt for the elevator, to run back to his quiet office above the pawn shop and pretend this conversation had never happened. But 15 years of guilt wouldn't let him move. Who else knew? About Maria's investigation? Just Angelo and his inner circle. Joe's eyes darted toward the elevator, then back to Vinny. About what we did to stop her? That's a smaller list. Much smaller. Jesus Christ, Joe. Vinny's voice cracked like thin ice. What did you do to her? Before Joe could answer, the elevator dinged softly, and Vinny watched his former partner's face go white as winter moonlight. A man in an expensive suit was walking toward their table, not rushing, not threatening, just moving with the casual confidence of someone who owned everything he could see. Vinny had never met him face to face, but he recognized the walk, the way other people seemed to fade into the background when he passed. Angelo Torino, his uncle, the man who'd built an empire on broken promises and shallow graves. Joe. Angelo's voice was warm, almost paternal, but Vinny noticed how his former partner's hands started shaking harder. Vincent. It's been too long. Vinny tried to stand, but Angelo waved him back down with a gesture that was somehow both gentle and absolute. Please sit. Enjoy your coffee. Binion's has excellent coffee. Mr. Torino, Vinny managed. His voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone braver or more foolish than he felt right now. I was just leaving. Were you? Angelo pulled out the third chair and sat down without invitation. Up close, he looked exactly like what he was, a grandfather who happened to kill people for a living. Silver hair perfectly groomed, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, hands that probably held grandchildren with the same steady grip they used to hold throats. That's unfortunate. Joe and I were hoping to have a conversation with you about old times. The poker games around them had gone quiet, not obviously, but in the way conversations naturally died when predators entered the room. Vinny could feel eyes watching them, then carefully looking away, the kind of studied ignorance that kept people breathing in a city where curiosity was a terminal disease. There's nothing to talk about, Vinny said, but even he didn't believe it. Angelo smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Oh, but there is. You see, Joe here has been feeling guilty about the past. Haven't you, Joe? Angelo's tone didn't change, but Joe flinched like he'd been struck. Guilt makes people do foolish things, like sending photographs to retired detectives who should know better than to ask questions. The manila envelope, the crime scene photos. Vinny's blood turned to slush in his veins as he realized Joe hadn't sent them out of conscience or friendship. He'd sent them because Angelo had made him, because this whole meeting was a setup from the moment the phone rang in his office. You want to know what happened to Maria Castellano, Angelo continued conversationally. It's natural. You're an investigator. But some investigations are like Pandora's box, Vincent. Once opened, they can't be closed again. Vinny's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, toward the .38 he'd carried for 20 years, but Angelo noticed the gesture and shook his head with fatherly disappointment. Now that would be very unwise. We're family after all, and family doesn't solve problems with violence. Angelo leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, completely in control. Family solves problems with understanding. Around them, the casino sounds had taken on a different quality, sharper, more dangerous, like the city itself was holding its breath to see what happened next. Vinny looked at Joe, searching for some sign of the man who'd saved his life, who'd been best man at his wedding, who'd stood beside him through 8 years of partnership. All he saw was fear wearing a familiar face. "What do you want?" Vinny asked. Angelo smiled wider. "Simple. I want you to stop looking for answers, and I want your word that this conversation never happened." But Vinny knew that in Las Vegas, some conversations echoed forever.